Okay, so our session today, Newcomers, Remaking Villages and Communities, will follow the similar format we've had for the other sessions. I'll give a little biography of our presenters. Presenters will each have 15 minutes to give their presentation. I'll be sitting over here and I'll give you a warning if you got 2 minutes left or 1 minute left. And then we'll have some time for question and answers. My name is Conrad Stoesz, and I'm the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives here in Winnipeg. Graham Schellenberg is a public relations professional and local historian based in Winnipeg. Originally from Rosenfeld, he's a descendant of Mennonite and Volhynian settlers on Treaty 1 territory. Graham serves as a board member of the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society and edits its quarterly newsletter, Heritage Posting. Additionally, he serves as a board member of the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. He's also served on the board of directors for both the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada and the Neuberchtal Heritage Foundation. Graham's research focuses on the West Reserve and Scratching River settlements. He previously worked on a community history project about the Alt-Birchtal School District with historian Lawrence Klippenstein, and a portion of his research is what we'll hear today. John Lehr is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Geography at the University of Winnipeg. His research interests focus on the settlement of ethnic and religious groups on the Canadian prairies, particularly Ukrainians, Hutterites, and Jews. His books include Community and Frontier, the Ukrainian Settlement in the Canadian Parkland, and with Yossi Katz, Inside the Ark, the Hutterites in Canada and the United States. Sherry Sawatzky-Dyck was born and raised in southern Manitoba. She and her husband live and work in Brandon. She has a Bachelor of Theology from Canadian Mennonite Bible College, a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Manitoba, and a Master of Divinity with a Pastoral Counseling stream from the University of Winnipeg. She has approximately 30 years of experience as a clinician in sex offender treatment, corrections, family therapy, work with First Nations communities, work in grief and loss as a hospital chaplain. She's been one of 2 counseling therapists at Brandon University since 2008. Recently, she's been doing research and interviewing daughters and granddaughters of Mennonite women who came to Canada from southern Russia in the 1920s for a book on generational trauma. Dr. Joan Garbutt is a writing skills specialist at Brandon University. Her main area of research is allyship in the context relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. She takes deep interest in stories and how these help build empathy for one another. Joan lives in Treaty 2 territory in the community of Rapid City, next to the Little Saskatchewan River, where she enjoys being outdoors, knitting, crocheting, spending time with family and friends. Ralph Friesen was born in Steinbach, Manitoba in 1945, the youngest of 6 children. His father was a minister and bookstore owner, his mother a quilter known for her stories and laughter. After graduating from high school, he worked for a year as a sports reporter and columnist for the Carillon News. Ralph has a master's degree in English literature and marriage and family therapy. He's published short fiction, poetry, reviews, and historical articles in variety magazines and periodicals. He is the writer of family history entitled Abram S. Friesen, Steinbach Pioneer, and a history of his hometown entitled Between Earth and Sky, Steinbach, the First 50 Years. He's also published a biography or memoir called Dad, God, and Me. And the most recent book, just published, it came off the press 2 days ago, you can get it at the back, called Prosperity Ever, Depression Never, Steinbach, the 1930s. Ralph is married with 2 adult children and 5 grandchildren. He lives with his wife Hannah in Victoria, BC. He retired from family therapy practice and devotes much of his time to research, writing, and playing tennis. I look forward to a good session. Thank you.
Thank you, how am I on sound? A little bit better? I'll crouch down. Thank you, Conrad, and good afternoon, everyone. Some of you may know, as Conrad mentioned, that I worked for some time on a history of the Alt-Birchtal area with my friend and mentor, Lawrence Klippenstein. One of the most interesting things to me about Altbergtal, though, is not Altbergtal itself. It's a little neighboring village just west of the original village site named Lichtfeld. Now, the small, short-lived village of Lichtfeld was only separated from Altbergtal by approximately 750 meters along the township road. If you stood at one end of the village street in Altbergtal, you could see Lichtfeld clear as day, and vice versa. Yet Lichtfeld, in all of the historiography about Altbergtal, has occupied a relatively minor place in Altbergtal's history. And so I hope today's study of Lichtfeld offers and serves as a tribute to some of its first residents and the friends I've been pleased to make along the way, Martha Martins, Bernie Wiebe, and Ben G. Wiebe, who unfortunately is no longer with us. So, back in the 1970s, Lawrence sat down with former Lichtfelder Abraham D. Friesen, who moved just west of the village as a young boy in 1893. In asking what happened to Lichtfeld, Friesen replied, quote, "One by one, families moved away from the village, and so it ceased to be, but Altbergtal remained." Now, whether or not Friesen was referring to the sense of place or just the physical village, it validated something for me that I observed during my research. Altbergtal maintains a strong sense of place among current and former residents. They have a distinct village site, direct access to Buffalo Creek, a school that served the community until 1965, and long-term intergenerational interest in former residents and their importance to the West Reserve. So over the next few minutes, I want to examine the rise, dissolution, and reemergence of Lichtfeld through something that's been termed a heritage conservation sense of place framework, specifically exploring how, as the village's social and functional structures eroded, Lichtfeld's identity faded and was subsumed by Altbergtal, which retained that enduring regional presence. The framework enables us to track Lichtfeld's development from a cohesive agrarian village to a dispersed community, its emergence as a regional hub in political matters, and finally an identity on the periphery today. As you see here, and I'll draw your attention to the screen, there's two township roads. One runs north-south and east-west. On the right-hand side, you see Altbergtal. You notice how it follows, the village street follows the contours of Buffalo Creek. Now, at the center point where those two township roads meet, there's two homesteads. That first homestead, just north of the township road, that is what we understand Lichtfeld was. There's a few trees towards the field there, and as Abraham shared with Lawrence in 1974, that is where the village street was, running north-south. Now, as you see today, there's not much left of Lichtfeld, but there is Altbergtal, with its enduring presence, with Buffalo Creek, and with that historical interest. Before we get into Lichtfeld and Altbergtal, I want to touch on that theoretical framework. A sense of place is hard to define. You might imagine that across disciplines from psychology to history or geography, there are varied interpretations. Now, in 2020, 4 researchers sought to define a sense of place in the context of heritage conservation, trying to understand the relationship between people and heritage sites. And they outline how it involves mental, emotional, and functional bonds that people have and develop, and how those bonds evolve with a heritage site, with their environment. And they identify 3 key dimensions: place identity, the cognitive aspect, how people mentally connect to a place through tangible aspects, buildings, the village site, Buffalo Creek, the landscape, and intangible, history, the traditions, the familial structures. There's also place attachment, the affective dimension, the emotional bonds that people form with a place, like pride, nostalgia, and belonging. And then there's place dependence, the conative aspect, the functional reliance on a place to meet needs, whether it's individual or communal. Now, when you stack these up alongside each other, you can appreciate that there's a dynamic nature here. The dimensions evolve, say, social or economic pressures weaken ties to a place, and conversely, memories may accumulate, and that feeling of nostalgia can perpetuate over time. And changes in place dependence, I think, significantly impact changes in identity and attachment. Now, there's one caveat here that I do want to note, and that's that the researchers try to apply this in a contemporary context, people who have an enduring connection to a heritage site. We don't have that in Lichtfeld, or at least not as much as we would think we should for this case, but I think we can still retrospectively apply the feelings of emotional and cognitive bonds from historical records, the documents that people left behind, their presence, what they did with their lives. So, historical background. Lichtfeld was founded in 1879 alongside Alt-Bergtal as part of a broader migration to the West Reserve. Bergtal Mennonites from the East Reserve, by way of South Russia, had come to Manitoba seeking better opportunities. I think, as many of us know, there were maybe less great opportunities in the East Reserve, and the West Reserve soon became appealing. We don't have a firm understanding of where the first Lichtfelders settled in the East Reserve, but we know that each of the families grew up in the village of Heuboden in South Russia. The major families included the Bergens, the Gerbrandts, the Giesbrechts, the Reimers, the Taves, and the Wiebes. But at the core of Lichtfeld sat the Gerbrandts, 5 siblings: Heinrich, Klaus, Helena, Jacob, and Dietrich. And the complex family networks helped to establish that sense of place identity and extend it, especially the emotional, the dependence, and the attachment. Helena Gerbrandt was married to Jacob W. Taves. As we see here, in 1883, the villagers petitioned to the government saying, "We live on this land, and we would like you to award a patent to Mr. Taves." Heinrich Wieb's wife was the sister of Dietrich Gerbrandt's wife, and Wieb was also a first cousin, we're getting into the Mennonite game here, but to the Reimers, Abraham, Peter, and Helena on their mother's side. And Helena, in turn, was married to Isaac Bergen. Now, the village's tangible aspects, the village structure, the layout, the buildings, systems of governance, of communal agriculture, presented and reinforced strong place dependence. The community relied heavily on shared resources and on each other. And at the same time, these communal activities fostered deep emotional bonds, the place attachment, right? Residents experienced that collective pride and shared responsibility in their village. But while the intertwining of community life created a strong emotional connection within Lichtfeld, its relationship with Alt-Bergtal augmented its sense of place. Lichtfeld's relationship with the nearby village was a defining feature in its early years, as we see in a map from Otto Gaub in the mid-1890s, one of 2 maps that correctly identify Lichtfeld's proper location in southeast 222. Between them sat Buffalo Creek, as we saw, a vital resource between the villages that became a symbol of their relationship. For example, in an 1897 letter to Der Nordwesten, a newspaper at the time, Lichtfelder Heinrich Wieb lamented that reckless hunters were endangering livestock in the area, stating, quote, "We only wish that the hunters would take care not to shoot in the Alt-Bergtaler and the Lichtfelder Buffalo Lake in such a brutal way as last year, because sheep and cows were considered ducks." He goes on to describe how a young girl in Alt-Bergtal had nearly lost her life. She was injured in such an incident when a horse dragged her, and gave a pretty serious threat, saying that if we saw it again, you would have to deal with me. As we see here, hunting was a big part of Buffalo Creek. Alt-Bergtal in the distance here, we see some Alt-Bergtalers, the Klippenstein family, hunting right after the turn of the century. It created that emotional investment in the environment, the sense of place attachment and dependence, and it extended further from livestock to hunting to the system of water was fundamental to their relationship. It brought people together. Now, beyond the creek, in 1884, Lichtfelders and Alt-Bergtalers cemented their ties through the establishment of a joint public school district, not often seen in many communities where they shared a system of education. We see here villagers or children from both Lichtfeld and Alt-Bergtal families. And not that it matters, but in the top row of boys, the second from the right is Mr. A.D. Friesen. He would have been about 6, maybe 5 years old at the time. A young Gerbrandt girl who attended the school there later stated, "The village I am from is Lichtfeld, but I went to school in Alt-Bergtal." And that younger generation increasingly was conjoined with that shared identity. And then there was the religious influence of Altbergtal's minister turned Altister or bishop, Johann Funk. He became the bishop in 1882 and further solidified these bonds, ordaining several men from the community, including Isaac Bergen of Lichtfeld, to join him in the ministerial. The school also became a central place of importance to Funk's religious aims, serving as the site for some of the early meetings to discuss the creation of the Mennonite Educational Institute, and also as a center for worship services between the local villages. But that leads me to Lichtfeld and its story. And it's really a story, as John Workington has talked about, for many villages in the West Reserve, of agricultural progress and individualism. Economic growth in the West Reserve was relatively immediate after settling. By the early 1880s, we witnessed large grain surpluses and the arrival of the railway, which connected semi-isolated villages to larger markets through towns such as Gretna and Altona. You'll note here, again, an early map from Mr. Workington that shows the original site of Lichtfeld, and you see, too, where the town of Altona began to emerge. In time, many of these villages disbanded, families transitioned away from communal farming practices, and their reliance on the village as a functional support system weakened. While they were seeking individual prosperity. Heinrich Wiebe was the first to depart Lichtfeld in 1885. He actually wrote to the federal government noting that he had cultivated all the land he could, and so he begged them to allow him to buy more. Many families followed, relocating to new homesteads or leaving the area altogether by the early 1890s. Concurrently, several prominent people, such as Wiebe, Peter Reimer, and Cornelius J. Bergman, drastically expanded their farm operations and began purchasing land outside the village in Bergfeld, Scheuenau, and Neuhoffnung. And this dispersion did more than just reduce the functional reliance on each other. I argue it altered the cognitive bonds that people had with Lichtfeld and with each other. It reduced opportunities for memory making and social interaction, which had fostered that sense of connection. Yes, people were related, but as families left, those ties diminished. And what we have on many maps now is no reference of Lichtfeld at all. You see Altbergtal here. I apologize, there's a lot of Sharpie from this old Waghorn map, but you note the presence of Altbergtal as the enduring feature. But there was a brief period of resurgence, and that came in political matters. Though fragmented as a community, Lichtfeld was briefly influential through Bergman, through Giesbrecht, and through Wiebe, who personally introduced new forms of meaning to what Lichtfeld represented in the West Reserve. They enabled a form of external place identity, I would argue, and dependence from the broader region on the kind of the district of Lichtfeld, if you follow. For example, here's a photo of what is understood to be the barn that Cornelius built in 1893, and potentially the house as well. And this photo was taken in the 1940s, shortly before it was demolished. This home, or at least this site, became the meeting place for the Arm of Rhineland Council from 1893 to the early 1900s. He was a longtime municipal councillor. Giesbrecht and Wiebe joined him at times on the local council, and Bergman was also one of the first Mennonites to seek provincial office and a seat in the legislature. Similarly, Heinrich Wiebe played an active role in provincial politics too, initially supporting the Liberal Party alongside Bergman. They were neighbors at the end of the day. But by 1907, their paths diverged. Bergman moved to Altona and shifted his allegiance to the Conservative Party, and Wiebe stayed a Liberal. While Bergman campaigned throughout the West Reserve against incumbent MLA Valentine Winkler, Winkler turned around and hired Wiebe to campaign for him against Bergman. It's said that Wiebe would go around in the community. Of course, this came as Manitoba was moving from a postage stamp to a larger province with a map in hand showing people that they should not pursue this option for the province. Now, Bergman carried the Altona poll, unsurprisingly, but he lost the election. But his political and business pursuits continued. He sought out a venture to develop a suburb in Winnipeg named after himself, and he also tried to establish a town northwest of Lichtfeld called Bergman as well. Now, the town operated more as a railway siding and a moonshining location, but that's another day's story. And the suburb never materialized, but it reinforced, or it introduced rather, a unique form of identity, dependence, not in emotional bonds, but in external relations with the village itself. Into the early 1900s, many of these families moved away. They passed on, or their descendants decided to leave the Lichtfeld area. As the lack of intergenerational continuity weakened the Lichtfeld's place identity, the new residents who came to the area, more or less the original village site and some homes located west, lacked the deep historical ties that had bound and anchored place identity and dependence. With this, so too went the attachment. By the mid-1930s, Lichtfeld's physical and social presence had largely disappeared. Maps and historical records misidentified its original location or omitted the village altogether. Lawrence noted to me that while the name Lichtfeld persisted in local memory, it was more understood by older residents who had connections with some Lichtfelders and these homes west of the original village site. This, what we see here, a sketch from Lawrence, demonstrates what people thought of Lichtfeld, but in fact, it was in the opposing quarter section, much closer to Altbergtal. Now, 1 minute, okay. For newcomers, Lichtfeld became a distant heritage symbol rather than an everyday sense of place and lived attachment. But what we see more recently is while the homes are now gone, those homes west of the village site, Lichtfeld has reemerged through new ways. Recent developments suggest a resurgence of place identity. In 2005, an Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite congregation established the Lichtfeld Mennonite Church, preferring its anglicized name, and it's been there ever since. We also see renewed historical interest in the village site and new homes that have emerged nearby, which indicates that the area's significance fosters a new type of connection. Lichtfeld is coming back in memory, but what it's grounded in is slightly different. Not the place identity grounded in everyday lives and shared experiences, but what newcomers ascribe to it in their sense of memory and history and nostalgia. And so today we have the Lichtfeld Mennonite Church, which you can see along Highway 30, I believe it is. My geography is a bit rough right now, and that endures as the legacy of Lichtfeld. That's my time, so thank you.
Good afternoon. My screen's gone black. Oh, there it is. Okay, today I'm going to talk about the transformation of a Mennonite village into a Hutterite colony. The village is Blumengart on the West Reserve, and it went from being a Mennonite Strassendorf or street village into a Hutterite Bruderhof. But I'll begin by talking about something that happened more recently. In the 6th of April in 2019, the Brandon Sun had a headline that said, Hutterite colony seeks to buy Mather, or it's Mather, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which is a small town in southwest Manitoba. And there were howls of outrage from a lot of rural people who felt that the Hutterites were encroaching into their way of life and buying up property, which is a pretty common refrain I've heard even last week. But this was not without precedent. This is the town of Mather. It's a population of 30 people, 4 or 5 families, and the Hutterites looked at it as a place to establish a new colony because it had all the services you need. It had roads, it had houses, it had land attached to it, and looked an ideal place for them to expand into. Furthermore, the colony that wished to expand was Willow Creek, which is in southwest Manitoba, just south of Cartwright. And as you can see, I don't know if this thing will work. No, my pointer doesn't work. But you can see that Mather is just, thank you, to the north and east Willow Creek, which is a huge advantage for a Hutterite colony which wishes to expand. I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Hutterites. I'm sure you know all of this anyway, but it's a Christian Anabaptist church which originated in Carinthia and Moravia at the time of the Reformation. It's named after Jacob Hutter, who was martyred in 1536. The theology, as you might expect, is very similar to that of the Mennonites, but there's no, the Mennonites, of course, have no commitment to communal living, but the Hutterites in the recent centuries have had one. Like the Mennonites, the Hutterites were persecuted for their beliefs, and Hutter, as I mentioned before, was martyred. They had a long history of migration through Europe, seeking refuge, ended up in Ukraine in 1770, and to the Molochtina area of southern Ukraine in 1842. They occasionally practiced community of goods, that is, that they lived communally. But it was not uniformly practiced, and it was, for most of the history, only done intermittently. They migrated to the United States between 1872 and 1874 because of pressure from the Russian government to adapt more to Russian ways, to abandon the German language, and to possibly, they feared, to perform alternative military service. So like the Mennonites, they came to North America for many of the same reasons. They moved initially to South Dakota, and they came in three groups. The Schmiedeleut, led by a guy called Michael Waldner, who was a Schmiede, a smith. The Darius-Leut, led by Darius Waldner, who's obviously his first name was Darius, and the Lehrerleit, led by Jacob Wipf, who was a teacher. And some came who did not practice community of goods, and they were known as the Prairielite. They settled individually and didn't settle in colonies. They prospered until 1917, when the US entered war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they underwent terrible privations, forced conscription. Some died in Alcatraz prison for their refusal to serve, which led them to move to Manitoba, where they had previously been given assurances of freedom of conscience when they came up during the Spanish-American War of 1899 and briefly established a colony near Dominion City. It lasted about 5 years. So the Schmiedeleut colonies moved to Manitoba. The others went to Alberta. They established colonies at Bonhomme, James Valley, Maxwell, Milltown, Rosedale, and Huron. Now these colonies, Bonhomme, Milltown, and Maxwell, were poised to branch. And branching is integral to the success of the Hutterites. The colonies function best when you have about 120 to 170 people. More than that, difficulties emerge, primarily because it's difficult to provide positions of importance and meaningful employment for greater numbers than, say, 170. It's important that everyone has a job. It's important that there's succession and people can move into positions of responsibility. So the way they adapt to this is by establishing a daughter colony. So a colony will branch out or split. And this is a long and involved process, takes about 10 years on average. And it means that they have to create a second colony, which is identical in terms of its wealth and facilities to the original colony. And then they decide who's to go to which colony by drawing lots. And they ensure, of course, that there's I guess you call it equality in terms of the various skills that are sent to each colony. So every colony must have a plumber, a smith, a mechanic, and so on. Who goes to which colony is decided by lot. And this is done so that they will know when you're building a new colony, everything is equal. It's going to be totally arbitrary as to whether you go to the old colony or go to the new colony. branching takes place because of the very high birth rate, roughly about every 30 to 35 years. And I just put this slide in to show how a colony of James Valley, one of the original colonies that came up from the Dakotas, how they have branched out. It's a long and involved process, and they branch frequently. Iberville, for example, has branched all over Manitoba. If we look at the colony which eventually took over the Mennonite village of Blumengart, began in Milltown in South Dakota, moved initially to Manitoba, where it established Milltown in 1918, and they branched out. The red colonies are those that were in the United States, and the blue colonies, the blue squares indicate colonies which were in Canada. But you can see that from the one colony of Milltown, which is in Cartier municipality, there was a movement to Blumengart. Don't know if I can show this. That will go. I'll move on. It went from Milltown to Blumengart. Blumengart then branched out to Sturgeon Creek, and later on Sturgeon Creek branched out yet again. So for the original five colonies that came up from the States in 1918, this is the number of Hutterite colonies in North America. The green dots show the Schmiedeleut colonies, which began in Manitoba, and the purple dots show the Darius-lite, and the yellow dots, the Lehr-lite. As you can see, there are now about 500 colonies in North America, all done by the branching process. So when Milltown, one of the first five colonies that came up in 1919, branched out, it went down to the Mennonite village of Blumengart, which fortuitously was in the process of moving to Mexico. So Blumengart and its land, about 4,000 acres, was for sale, and Milltown colony bought the land. Now this is what, in its heyday, Blumengart would have looked like. This is Gnadental, a Mennonite street village in the same area. Very long, linear village, and totally unsuited to the way the Hutterites organized their society. And it was one of many Mennonite villages on the West Reserve which had this Strassendorf formation. The Hutterite colony is very different. The society eschews individuality, and therefore they prefer to live in clusters. They don't live they live in individual houses, but the houses are not on individual plots. They live together in a residential part of the colony. And most Hutterite colonies will look like this colony, James Valley. They purchased 4,000 acres at Blumengart, and the houses, and I believe also the implements. I took this information, by the way, from Bruce Weeb's book, Despairing in Canada, Land Transactions of Hutterite Immigration to Canada, which, if any of you have the chance to get it, is I think a brilliant piece of academic research, and you can buy it from Baker Colony bookstores. Really good book. This is the book, and I owe a lot of information I got on the land transactions, which I won't go into here, from Mr. Weeb's book. When they bought Blumengart, it was a Strassendorf street village and looked like this, which again I got from Mr. Weeb's book. But again, not suited to the Hutterite way of life, which prizes equality and the idea of living in your own house on an individual piece of land does not accord with the Hutterite belief system. Blumengart in 1948, which is the oldest air photo I could obtain, looked like this, and you can clearly see the original Mennonite form of the village is still intact, more or less, although there has been some change. And gradually they're moving away from the idea of grouping houses along the village street and grouping them together in a residential area and segregating the residential area from the agricultural component of the colony. A recent Google Earth map shows that the colony itself has now largely, in fact completely obliterated the former form of the Mennonite Strassendorf. It looks like a typical Hutterite colony, except that it is not. It is very unusual in a number of respects. First of all, it's the only Canadian Hutterite colony named on a Canadian topographic map. Hutterite colonies are not named. They're just shown as clusters of buildings. But because Blumengart was a Mennonite village and was a place, it's still marked as a village, not as a colony, so it still appears on Canadian topographic maps. These are the kind of things that geographers get excited about, so I understand if you're a little bit underwhelmed by that. Secondly, it's the only Canadian Hutterite colony located astride a public highway. There's no other colony that I'm aware of in North America which has a public highway going through it. There are colonies which have public highways going nearby or close to, but not through. This is the only place you can legally drive in on a public road through the middle of a colony. The other thing which is worthwhile noting is that in Manitoba, there's no official signage as to the place of a Hutterite colony. There is in Saskatchewan for some reason, and I've seen some in Alberta, official signs, but not in Manitoba. Now you will find signs to Manitoba Hutterite colonies, but these are erected by the people who live there. And the reason for that is that the Hutterites like to stay away from the sinful world. They regard their colony as an ark sailing on a sea of sin. And so the colony has to be leak-proof. They don't want water coming in, and roads bring in outside ideas into the colony. So if you do pass by a Hutterite colony, usually you'll find it screened off by tree planting, which is partly as a shelter belt, but also partly to conceal the colony. And also they will locate them in places where they're hard to find. I thought I knew Hutterite colonies very well. I've been on scores of them over the past 30 or 40 years. But I was looking for a place called Baker Colony. I wanted to buy a copy of Mr. Weeb's book. So I took a quick look at Google Maps, thought, yeah, I can find this. And I drove out. Now, Baker Colony is the other side of Portage la Prairie. So I went out, and I couldn't find it. I thought I knew where I was going. I got lost. I'm a geographer, and I never get lost, but I did get lost. I wandered around the prairies, and I asked people, and they said, oh, it's over there somewhere. And I stopped people. No one knew where the damn thing was. And eventually, I said, to heck with it, and I drove home. And I had to get a book in the mail. Anyway, I'm out of time and out of subject matter, so thanks for your attention.
Good afternoon. I have no slides, and my presentation is a little bit different theme. So as part of a larger study on the impact of trauma over generations, I interviewed daughters and granddaughters of women who fled southern Russia in the 1920s in order to gain their perspective on the long-term social, emotional, and spiritual impact of their ancestors' trauma on them. Because, as according to Cron, history secretly embeds itself in the hearts and minds of those who live it, And this subjective experience of history is a story that needs to be told. This presentation explores the protective support the Mennonites who came to North America in the 1870s provided to Mennonites such as these women. Mennonites who came to North America via the Netherlands, through Prussia, and then through southern Russia, made the trek in 3 major migrations, as you all know: the mid-1870s, the mid-1920s, and then after the Second World War. My maternal ancestors were Mennonites who came in the 1870s, and I saw little glimpses maybe of a few of them in some of the different presentations. And my paternal ancestors came in the 1920s. Each of these Mennonite groups has its own unique story, but a common history. In the early years of the 20th century, amid disease, starvation, and increased violence, the Mennonite community in southern Russia experienced a great deal of suffering, wherein entire villages were slaughtered, many men disappeared or were murdered in front of their families, women and girls were sexually assaulted, disease and starvation ravaged the region. Therefore, between 1923 and 1930, around 25,000 Mennonites left southern Russia for North America and South America. Of those, around 21,000 came to Canada. These Mennonites were, as you know, nicknamed the Russländer. The 1870s Mennonites in Canada, the Kanadier, with some assistance from American Mennonites as well as the Swiss Mennonites in Ontario, facilitated aid to Mennonites in southern Russia prior to their emigration in the form of food, farm implements, clothing, medical assistance, and spiritual care. Many journals and letters from Russian Mennonites at the time convey the positive and even life-saving impact these supports had on those suffering. As an example, according to John Rempel in Marianne Lowen's book, Sons and Mothers, his mother, Katharina, was a child when in 1920, typhoid and starvation were rampant in southern Russia. She reports that Mennonite Central Committee provided some of the only sustenance to the villagers. Katharina recalled her father being responsible for the distribution of food to the dying and bedridden at the time. In 1921, her father died of typhoid, leaving her mother nearly inconsolable. Gathering spiritual and physical strength from the food and preaching from North American Mennonites, she reported her mother was able to muster up the energy to care for her family for a few more years until she died in 1926. Similarly, the Kanadier arranged safe passage out of Russia, documentation for seamless passage through the various ports along the way, and finally, they negotiated a privilegium or contract with the Canadian government to ensure certain rights and privileges. They provided or facilitated transportation, food, lodging en route, and upon arrival in Canada, as well as short-term and long-term employment, and then land acquisition prospects. Similarly, employment for the adults, schools for the children, they were all a priority upon arrival in this new country. And these school and employment allowed the refugees to find mentors, friends, and a sense of community in this new country. It also added meaningful and purpose-driven activity to their lives while making a living and contributing to their own upkeep. These are all important pillars of good mental health. Finally, the Canadian government warned the refugees not to strain the Canadian medical system, so the Canadier built systems to facilitate and finance the medical needs of their members. Because there were segments of the Mennonite population in Canada who objected to this refugee initiative, the Russländer were only housed in those who wanted them and welcomed them, and only in culturally appropriate homes, i.e. Mennonite homes. This was despite offers from non-Mennonites to house the refugees. Nonetheless, the community support of non-Mennonites was also important in the recovery process, as non-Mennonite neighbors became friends and business associates, easing the transition. The Canadier immigration team was also diligent in ensuring the Russländer refugees stayed in homes with families, rather than refugee centers, hotels, or apartments, and families were to be kept together. Similarly, the team made every effort to keep orphaned children with their siblings or with their extended families. These guidelines provided physical safety, as well as a sense of community, a familiar language, food, church, schools, and even physical building structures in many cases, as many of these Mennonites settled in traditional Mennonite villages previously vacated by Kanadier, who were moving south. These villages had their homes and barns often attached close together along a central street, allowing for collaborative farming, shared resources, and reduced social isolation. These refugees came to Canada in large groups, with a language and religious background like their hosts, despite some theological differences. Many stories and personal accounts speak of the opportunity to worship and practice communal prayer and hymn singing as they waited in the trains for the trains in Russia, as they traveled, and again together with their hosts once they arrived in Canada. Personal accounts speak to the significance of these spiritual encounters as opportunities to say goodbye to those they left behind, to share their anxieties and fears, even though it wasn't usually without words, and to contribute to the diaspora effect, linking their common history and collective identity. The task of moving these many traumatized people halfway around the world was an enormous and complex one. Garbutt, author and physician, in his work on the impact of trauma on health and well-being, outlines distinct types of traumas with different effects on the person. The first is what he calls capital T trauma, or identifiable, hurtful, or overwhelming events in childhood or later in life. And the other one he terms small T trauma, or, quote, less memorable but hurtful and far more prevalent misfortunes of childhood, unquote. Mate warns, unless it is sorted out, trauma will impact that person's family generations later. This group had experienced both types of trauma. For example, my grandmother was 8 years old when the Russia-Japan War resulted in revolution, and she told stories to her children about her hiding in the bushes when she was a child, whenever the anarchists came by. She was 17 when Lenin incited civil war. She was 21 and a newlywed when World War I broke out, and a widow and temporary homeless by the age of 22, and a single mother by the age of 23. Then a refugee by the age of 25. Her children describe how their family culture impressed on them the need to keep negative sentiments to themselves, as the painful stories needed to stay in the past. I see this symbolized in my aunt's story of a photo in the drawer, and the drawer is probably like one of those that we talked about this morning. The photo was of their mother and her first husband, not my grandfather, who had been lost to the chaos of southern Russia. The family had a concept of who was in the photo, but the stories related to that photo, like the photo itself, remained in the drawer untold. Ensign Myers, who have outlined in Healing Haunted Histories the history of Mennonites, is punctuated by migration, as well as war, calamity, and generations of hardship, but also perseverance and resilience. As such, the impact of trauma and suffering through the generations are not just about difficult events that happened to parents and grandparents years ago, but rather socioeconomic and religious worldviews that trace themselves through the generations, as I see with my Mennonite ancestors. All too often, the generational impact of trauma takes the form of addiction or violence or antisocial behavior. However, none of the women that I talked to in my study expressed concern around these issues affecting their families. They did, however, indicate that their physical and psychological health has been paying a price for the untold stories. Their ancestors certainly did benefit from significant support, allowing for a certain amount of healing from generations of suffering. But silence had also taken its toll. The daughters and granddaughters I spoke to all stated they were not taught that these terrible experiences were a punishment by God, nor were they raised with a sense of vengeance or anger. Rather, they were taught it was due to God's faithfulness that their family settled in a new land, and that they must be thankful to God for being delivered. They learned that in response to God's faithfulness, a steadfast work ethic of loving kindness, care, and compassion was essential. However, this deliverance came at a cost. One daughter, we'll call her Jane, expressed the intergenerational impact well when she said her mother's story adds, quote, adds to the big burden of sadness of life, unquote. Her mother came to Canada as a widow with a young child, and despite many protective factors, as a single woman with a child, she had few prospects except to work as a domestic or marry again. As Marlene Epp explains in her book, Mennonite Women in Canada, quote, an entrenchment of normative gender roles frequently occurred as well, including a renewed emphasis on female subservience and subordination, unquote. This daughter's family did not discuss topics of gender equality, feminism, sexualized violence. And she often felt her mother's almost intangible melancholy or sadness related to her inability to express gifts and talents or contribute a significant sense of meaning to her life outside of her role as wife, mother, and caregiver. This had a long impact on the daughter. Jane's mother moved to Canada with her parents and siblings, but was able to lodge with her sister upon arrival to Canada, because her sister had come about a year earlier. Her new home was a traditional village similarly inhabited by refugees who hailed from neighboring villages in Russia. They were familiar with each other. They had a shared experience. The village had social opportunities like a choir and a church. These factors eased her transition. However, her own mother died shortly after arrival to Canada. Her father and siblings were relocated to another village far away. Not far away in our terms, but far away in their terms. And now she had the task of supporting herself and her child on her own with limited resources. Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, outlines the benefit of community and living in relationship as both a protective force and as a trauma recovery tool. Studies show that safety and terror cannot coincide in a person, and that good social support networks are the most powerful protectors against being traumatized for adults just as much as for children. Quote, in order to recover, body, mind, and brain need to be convinced that it is safe to let go. That happens only when you feel safe at a visceral level and allow yourself to connect that sense of safety and with past helplessness. Our attachment bonds are our greatest protection against threat, unquote. There is no doubt the arduous work of the Kanadier not only saved the lives of the Mennonites suffering in Russia, but reduced the impact of trauma and gave them a sense of safety to begin the recovery process. Mennonites from Russia through Prussia and the Netherlands came from a long history of displacement, suffering and trauma, as well as resilience, privilege, and opportunity. Their belief so the trauma was generational and the recovery therefore complicated. Their belief in the essential role of community, God's faithfulness, as well as the ethic of thankfulness appear to have been very protective. However, this protection was not all-encompassing, as the trauma is still felt generations later. The daughters and granddaughters interviewed acknowledged their ancestors did not appear to have the tools necessary to articulate and process all the hardships that they experienced, inadvertently leaving that to subsequent generations. In fact, the women interviewed all expressed an appreciation for the opportunity to reflect on the intergenerational legacy of trauma while also acknowledging the burden it has had on them over time. These women were practical examples of how sorting out our history can give us tools, language, and information that helps us to make sense of why we act the way we do and why we feel the way we do. It appears this understanding can help us better manage mental health and wellness issues. As researchers understand trauma better, we are learning that trauma is transmitted through the generations through both virtue via family systems, culture, language, and nature through physical illness, chronic pain, and mental health issues. Research is increasingly making it evident that no person is immune to the trauma experienced by their ancestors. It is therefore our task as human beings to do what we can to prevent calamity and mitigate the impact of trauma to the degree it is possible by having policies and systems that provide culturally and emotionally sensitive programs and services which facilitate community and safety to all persecuted and traumatized people. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, how many of you have never lived in Steinbach, Manitoba? Could I get a raise? Well, there's a lot of outsiders here. This presentation is taken from a chapter of a book that's just been published, and it's for sale here, called Prosperity Ever, Depression Never, Steinbach in the 1930s. And this presentation is on the identity shift that took place during that time. I realized too late that I should have taken a lesson in how to do PowerPoint. So there are going to be some rough intervals when we do this thing on the screen. We'll see. In 1933, Steinbach Post editor Arnold Dick wrote a satirical sketch claiming that when God created the earth, he made a place of stones and swamp and marked it with a sign, Steinbach, which he wrote in German, since when he talks to himself and when keeping records, God uses only the German language. In Dick's mind, language, both High and Low German, was a defining feature of Mennonite identity. But German was already giving way to the dominant language of the land, English. 2 years earlier, a letter writer to the Post lamented this development. Quote, "Many children can no longer read a German book or write a letter in German to their grandparents, uncles, and aunts. Do we not hold to our German prayer, church songs, Bible? Often we hear of old German-speaking parents being a target of mockery of their English-speaking children. As if that wasn't bad enough, those same children were being given un-Mennonite names, where before there had been Jacob, Peter, Anna, and Maria. Now there was Harvey, Lawrence, Gladys, and Elaine. Economic circumstances also accelerated assimilation. Young women like Russländer and Neufeld, who was received by the Kanadier, went to work as domestics in Winnipeg, thus becoming, quote, acquainted with Anglo-Saxon customs in food, clothing, language, and amusement, which upon their return, they introduced into the Mennonite settlement. If the Mennonites became anglicized, could they still call themselves Mennonites? Arnold Dick's categorical answer was, nay. In one of his Kaupenbua sketches, here you see Kaupenbua, his characters discuss the decision of traditionalists to move to Mexico and Paraguay rather than succumb to the forces of assimilation. Inspector Taves states his opinion. Et lei vigona hier aus Minister ut, onja. I believe that we will not survive here in Canada as Mennonites. He continues, Wann unsere Kinder erst Englisch sein, dann sind sie nicht mehr Mennonisch. At the point where our children are English, they are no longer Mennonite. But the conservatives who remained in Canada had no strategies other than entrenched resistance to change. Could there be some other way to survive as a people? Dyck thought so. The fledgling Nazi government in Germany had seized upon the pan-German movement, which sought to unify all German-speaking people in a single nation-state or Reich. Dyck and others, mainly but not only Russländer, placed their hopes for cultural survival in the same doctrine. Even Steinbach could shelter under the umbrella of Hitler's Reich. As early as 1931, 2 years before the Nazis came to power, Dyck reprinted a sympathetic biography of Adolf Hitler from a German newspaper. In general, he fell in with the Nazi narrative of a proud, racially and politically purified Germany. By 1934, when Jews were being openly persecuted, Dyck gave a page to someone signing himself as layman, dismissing stories about atrocities committed against the Jews as propaganda, but then perpetuating anti-Semitic stereotypes. Quote, they came into Germany after the war, dominated the press, the universities, the judiciary, the theater, cinema, banks. Many Jews, unfortunately, are also Bolsheviks. Dyck, intelligent and sensitive though he was, could not help conflating German Mennonite identity with a sense of superiority. Returning by car from an expedition to southern Manitoba to Ukrainian and French communities, he extolled the virtues of Steinbach. As we roared along from Le Brocquerie northwards on a good highway, now in full darkness, and Steinbach came into view with its streetlights and electrically lit 4-story mill, we had to say to ourselves one more time, in all of southeast Manitoba, Steinbach is the only place where one feels one has returned to culture. That could have been a surprise to others, but to which he added, there must be something to the science of types and race. In May of 1934, the Nazi government sent Helmut Wollenweber, a farmer, actually a professor at the University of Rostock, to Steinbach to share their vision of the new Germany. National Socialism, quote, simply wanted to keep the German race pure as a farmer wants to keep his seed grain pure. Post correspondent Gigi Cornelsen observed that Wollenweber made an impression with his proper High German and strong personality. That fall, the Post published an ad for 2 films Wollenweber was showing in Winnipeg, Deutschland erwacht, Germany Awakes, and Tag der Nationalen Arbeit, National Work Day. I think this is there. This is from Tag der Nationalen Arbeit, from the film. Readers were assured that these films are of an entirely different sort than those which Mennonites avoid because of their damaging influence. Tickets at 20 cents could be picked up at the offices of the Post. As for religion, Mennonites could tell themselves that Hitler, if not a conventional Christian, nevertheless was not a threat. A front-page Post article quoted Reverend Abram Kraker, editor of the Friedensstimme, the Voice of Peace in Russia, hopefully claiming that Hitler was a Catholic, a believer in God. And David Taves, chairman of the Canadian Board of Colonization, stated after his 1936 visit to Germany that, quote, no one has anything bad to say about Hitler. In 1936, Stuttgart writer Karl Goetz, employed by the Auslands Institute for Foreign Countries, spoke in the basement of the new Steinbach High School, urging his audience to join the pan-German movement. I mean, it's a little freaky to think that they were coming from Germany and speaking in the high school auditorium. In 1938, Jacob H. Janssen, Low German playwright and Waterloo Kitchener Mennonite Eltester, was commissioned by Walter Quiring of the Auslands Institute to track down all locations in North America where descendants of Russian Mennonites settled. With not a little pride, Janssen reported that all of the commercial enterprises and stores are in German hands. There are no Jews in Steinbach. And there had been a Jewish presence, actually, until the early 30s. Meanwhile, leading citizen John D. Goosen traveled to Europe that year and felt rather flattered, quote, to be taken for a fellow German when greeted with Heil Hitler at the information office in Cologne. All of this occurred in the context of widespread discrimination against Jews, even in Canada. After a meeting with Hitler in Berlin in 1937, Prime Minister Mackenzie King wrote in his diary that Hitler is really one who loves his fellow man. As it turned out, the majority of Steinbach residents were not especially interested in grand notions of pan-Germanism. By the late 30s, regular business bulletins appeared in the Steinbach Post in English, although Low German was still the common language at home and in the shops, and High German still the language of the church. School instruction was given in English. As World War II commenced, the teachers of the East Reserve decided to suspend German language instruction in religion and language, as long as England and Canada are at war with Germany. As G.G. Cornelsen sadly admitted, the funeral song for our German language had been sung. English streamed into the village via radio, newspapers, and films. It was not just language without content either. The messages were often nationalistic, urging responsible citizenship and patriotism. Even the identification of religion with German had weakened. English started to find its way into church services. At the funeral of inventor Plett's father in the Kleine Gemeinde Church in 1933, one of the ministers spoke in English, and soon this was standard practice. P.D. Friesen ordered English language evangelical hymn books for use at Jugendverein, young people's meeting. The Brudertaler Gemeinde started to conduct Sunday evening services in English, and by the 1940s, the Kleine Gemeinde would follow suit. Actually, the strongest movement influencing Steinbach during the decade was British and Canadian nationalism. When Governor General Lord Bessborough visited Steinbach in August of 1933, citizens went to much trouble to prepare, even though it was harvest season. They erected a gate of honor at the northern entrance to Main Street, decorated with spruce boughs and Union Jacks, with a large placard reading "Welcome." They built a platform at the school, seen here, from which Bessborough could address the people. But he stayed only 20 minutes, tossing off a 1-minute speech in which he told the school children to remind their teachers that his birthday was October 27, and they should get a holiday that day. A fly past by the locally built Pete and Pole airplane, a few more speeches by elected representatives of the region. That was it. That's another view of the school and the people assembled to hear Bessborough. All was forgiven, though, on the occasion of the coronation of King George VI. On Coronation Day, May 12, 1937, school children formed a flag parade on Main Street, while the newly formed brass band played and speeches were given by the head of the Board of Trade, along with ministers from each of the 4 Mennonite congregations. The Steinbach Collegiate Yearbook featured a crown and the words "Coronation Year" on the front cover. In May and June of 1939, King George and Queen Elizabeth toured Canada, the first time a reigning monarch had visited. The tour was a great success, with large crowds gathered to greet the depression-weary Canadians. With large crowds gathered to greet the royals as they traversed the country by train. As one historian put it, a whiff of glamour excited depression-weary Canadians. That certainly seemed to be the case for Steinbachers. The Post ran a full-page ad welcoming the King and Queen, sponsored by 26 businesses, as well as Hanover Municipality and the Steinbach Dorfskomitee. When watchmaker P.D. Friesen, accompanied by his wife and 2 young boys and his and his parents traveled to Winnipeg for the occasion. Watching from the show window of a hospital jeweler named W. Finkel, they were rewarded with the sight of the royals. Quote from his diary, "Big crowds, roaring welcome. Everybody likes the king and queen. God save them." Teachers at the collegiate organized senior students to attend the spectacle as well. And this is a picture from the yearbook showing the Royals at Polo Park with a group of young people in the grandstands holding a Steinbach banner. One student wrote, "We came to Polo Park to show our loyalty to our king and country. We left Polo Park just as loyal as ever, but combined with this feeling of loyalty was a feeling of warm and lasting friendship for these two people." Steinbachers chose not to comment on the belligerent symbolism of the 1939 tour, which had begun in Ottawa with the dedication of the National War Memorial and included a 4-day visit to the United States, reinforcing Anglo-American relations on the eve of the imminent war. Collegiate Principal Julius Taves assured his students that they would cherish the memory of the royal visit as the outstanding moment of their lives, and urged them to remember also the King's message: be true patriots, desirable citizens, and good Christians. Even car dealers got on board, with J.E. Regier Garage erecting a tall pole from which flew the Union Jack. During the Second World War, at least 117 persons from Steinbach and district served in the Canadian Armed Forces, and in Manitoba as a whole, around 2,000 Mennonite men participated, compared to about 2,500 who served as conscientious objectors. Many of the ministers, teachers, and business people who showed so much enthusiasm for the British Royals were now dismayed at their young men's decision to go to war. The aforementioned John D. Goosen could not have anticipated that all of his 4 sons would enlist in the Canadian military. One of his daughters would go to work in a munitions factory. A large chunk of Mennonite identity, not only as German speakers, but also as a non-resistant people, broke off and floated away. The Steinbach of the future, as Inspector Taves had foreseen, would be no longer Mennonite.
Thank you very much for those papers. Time for some questions. Okay.
Thank you. Question for Ralph. How do you bring together this respect for Hitler?
Can't hear you. You need the microphone.
Oh, sorry. It feels like I got to change my voice. How did they bring together respect for the King and for Canada, and also this, close attachment apparently to Hitler? Did they at all deal with the dichotomy of that at all, or how?
Well, I haven't thought about that very much, but my first response to that is that the British Royals, and at least at the beginning, they identified somewhat as German themselves. They were the same family, and I think there was a kind of a Nazi sympathizing stream in there, among the royal family. So and at first, of course, the Nazi threat or whatever, the Nazis didn't look like what they later became. So I think maybe those were a couple of the factors. It all was an idea of monarchy ruling over that, and I think the Mennonites historically have never been that interested in democracy.
Can you elaborate on that? Democracy?
There's other questions?
What was the reaction of the Canadian government or even the Manitoba government when they were talking about Hitler?
Of the Canadian Manitoba government
To the issue of Hitler being brought into conversation here.
Yeah, you'd think, hey, wait a minute, they're coming into our towns here in our country, and they're a foreign power. But I don't have a record of that. I can only imagine, apparently there was no obstacle, and at that point yet, in 1933, Germany was not officially an enemy state. They weren't at war. They were going to be at war, but that was going to come. So I think at that time, they might have looked askance, and maybe if they had known the message of these people who were promoting more German language, they might not have liked that, but I don't know. They got through and did it. Yeah, I'm not sure there isn't a record of Canadian or Manitoba government saying we object.
I just want to confirm some of what you've said, because my father would have turned 18 the year the war was over. And my father would have been, a Royal Air Force pilot come hell or high water, if he could have, right? And my roots are from 1874. I'm Mennonite on one side and Lutheran on the other side, so probably had some, more leanings to, potentially going to war when you had some Lutheran in you. And so there's also these Lutheran swirlings around also in the Steinbach
indeed.
area. So it's an interesting thing. And I could tell you that my great aunt just wouldn't even believe what the Nazis had done. I mean, because of that German thing that wasn't possible. That wasn't true, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, just a further comment.
Upstairs, question?
Just a clarification, Sherry, sorry. It may be a misheard. Was it the Russländer or the Kanadier that established medical facilities? I thought I heard you say the Kanadier, but I thought places like the Concordia was established by the Russländer.
Well, it was really important for the Manitoba government and Canadian government that they look after their own medical services, and so the degree to which they could, the Canadier had established some preliminary medical services in southern Manitoba already. But like the Concordia, that's a hospital in Winnipeg. So that would have been a larger project. But like there were last year, there was actually a presentation on, the Board of Colonization working to make sure that their people were taken care of medically and that they weren't deported. And so they were beginning the process of making sure that was taking place by the early 1920s.
Okay, thanks.
Hutterite question. Maybe you said it and I slept through a minute or two, like it's the afternoon, early afternoon, right? How was it that they could buy this village? Did it have anything to do with these people going to Mexico, or how did that village become available to the Hutterites?
Yeah, my understanding is that when the Mennonites moved to Mexico, the land was acquired or put in the hands of a real estate company and went on the open market, and the Hutterites just availed themselves. They were able to assemble the money for the mortgage and to purchase what would be about 4,000 acres, including the village.
I've got 3 questions, but I wanted to exercise Mike Holder's prerogative and jump in with one small one for Graham. Graham, I like how you end with the anglicized Lichtfeld church planting taking place on the old village of Lichtfeld. Given the late 1800s influence of U.S. Religious currents in that same region, do you see kind of a resonance, a present-day resonance? I think you said this church had its base in eastern Pennsylvania, if I'm mistaken?
It's an interesting question. I think Conrad has given light to some of the American influences in the West Reserve at the time at the MMHS AGM last year, and we do see that in the local region, yes. Alcester Funk at the time, I'm not going to directly answer your question, I don't think at the end, but Alcester Funk in the Bergtal School, you see in the 1890s that American teachers were starting to come in. So to some extent, yeah, I do think that there's maybe an undercurrent that carries from that time to now, yeah.
This question for Sherry. So you said that, and Joan, that in the 1920s, Russländer families were paired up with Kanadier families, right, as sort of culturally matching. I think there's a term like something that you mentioned like that. That's fascinating. Was there like a formal process for how that worked, about how the government matched up these families, or was that sort of more loosey-goosey? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, the research shows that the degree to which it was possible, it was a formal process that the numbers were very large for the number of people that came into Canada, and a lot of the Canadier were leaving at the same time that the Russländer were coming. And so it wasn't always possible, but the degree to which it was possible, they worked really, really hard to keep them housed in homes. And particularly they started, because the Russländer moved to Saskatchewan first, and so Saskatchewan made the first effort to make sure that the Saskatchewan had about 700 people in 1923, and so the degree to which it was possible, they worked really hard on making it an official process. Yeah.
Right upstairs.
So you guys have kind of wrecked the whole conference, you know. So we were studying the 1870 migrants as a coherent group, and now you're bringing in Hutterites, and you bring in the Russländer and the Nazis and the Pennsylvania, you know, guys. Like, this is getting really messy. Do you think that there's still a coherent, like, Kanadier subject to study?
Who's it directed at?
I think either anyone can answer that.
I think there is. Yeah, there's a difference. As an example, my mom is a Canadian, and my dad is a Russländer, and I grew up that my mom is from the Sommerfelder Church, and in the Sommerfelder Church, my experience as a child was that the Sommerfelders drank and smoked, but then they, at church, the men were on one side and the women were on the other side, and my grandmother always wore a head covering, and the women didn't have any role in the church. My dad's father, later as an adult, got baptized in the Bergtaler Church in Winkler, and my experience as a kid was that my aunts on my dad's side were educated, were professionals, and none of the women or men on my mom's side were professionals or formal education. And so for me as a child, there was my dad's side, no drinking, no movies, no card playing, but women had roles and education. And then on the other side, women didn't, but then they were conservative but liberal, and then so it was really, as a child, very confusing, but very different culturally. And I think now, as I'm an adult, I still see a huge difference in the way that the families work and function in the world. And as a clinician, anecdotally, I would say if I have clients who have a Mennonite background and are struggling with addiction issues or antisocial kind of behavior, 9.5 times out of 10, they're from the 1870s group, not from the 1920s group. So that's an interesting thing for me. I would like to study further. I think it's an interesting.
Which one was the 1870s? Are they the drinking and stuff?
Yeah.
All right, we've got a little bit of time left over here in the front.
Okay. I have a question about the Hutterite colonies. It was very interesting to me to see how you showed there's a mother colony and then these daughter colonies, and they're set up to be exactly like the mother colony. So, but my experience with Hutterite colonies is that they're very different in terms of how conservative they are, or how, you know, how worldly or not they are. How did that happen?
Yeah, I think it's also a mistake to think that Hutterite colonies don't change. I've had friends on James Valley Colony for 40 odd years, and we are very good friends. And over that time, the colony has changed. It depends upon the leadership. I knew John Hofer, who was the minister of James Valley, and technically still is, only he now has Alzheimer's and no longer functions properly as minister. But since the minister's changed, the regime has changed, and a colony which used to be very welcoming to outsiders no longer is welcoming. So colonies change, they evolve, and they could well go back to being more welcoming when this new generation of leadership changes. So yeah, it's very tempting to talk about Hutterite colonies as though they're all the same, at least within the same light, but they're not. You can have as you're probably aware, there was a schism in the 1990s in the Schmiedeleut between so-called Group 1 and Group 2. And there are slight differences in the way they do things. But I know some so-called conservative colonists who are actually more liberal, some of the supposedly more liberal Group 1. I mean, it's very fluid, and it changes decade by decade.
All right, we have time for one last question anywhere.
I'd be remiss if I didn't clarify this issue, and I think it has to do with the Russländer and establishing health facilities, especially in the East Reserve. And I think Ralph mentions this in his book previous to this last one. And it was the votes in Steinbach that actually started the hospital there. And the reason I mention that I know this is because they are my in-laws. And so I think I needed to clarify that yes, the Russländers in Steinbach did build the health facility. And as a segue to that, my mother-in-law, who was a genealogist, she actually had the records from her dad and supplied me with my mom's birth record in 1933 from that hospital.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks for our panelists.
Conrad.